Good evening, everyone. I hope we have you. So, again, good evening, everyone. My name is Shagufta Siddhi, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you back to season 2 of the much loved Asha Ganga Jamuni Talks. So, Ganga Jamni Foundation, that I founded in 2019, just before the pandemic hit us, promotes cross cultural dialogue and understanding. So, we do this in the shape of live and online talks. We've organized bed hugs, heritage walks, and cultural tours to do this. We're also working towards building a digital people's archive of Greater Banaras region. Ganga Jamni documents lives of people, festivals, rituals, rites, and a whole lot of other things that basically demonstrate the rich cultural heritage that we have. Today's topic of our discussion will shed light on a burning topic. Now, to what extent does our past determine our present? Why is our past so important in our identity formation? To what extent does the contemporary political discourse see the past as a weapon to secure its vote bank? I was a part of the audience for the India Today's debate with Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Vikram Sampad recently, and there I actually listened to their discussion, which was quite interesting and many questions were discussed. Now, Asha Ganga Jamuni, Asha stands for Aligarh Society for History and Archaeology, and Ganga Jamuni Season 1, which is available on YouTube and Facebook pages of the two organizations, has brought great historians of repute and credibility before you and have presented their arguments before all of you, and many of you were regular participants in our discussions on these issues. Today, we have a discussion on one of the most loved Mughals of all. But the question is, how safe is Akbar? How safe is this particular Mughal from the onslaught that has been going on? And to have this discussion, I am going to invite Professor Ali Nadeem Rezavi, who you all know. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
So, Professor Rezavi, as you know, is a professor at Aligarh Muslim University, and he was earlier the head of the Department of Center for Advanced Studies and Department of History at Aligarh Muslim University. He also is an author, and he has been contributing regularly on his blogs. And you can also look at the Facebook page of Asha and the History Learner to know more about Sir. We have our guest today, and our guest is Manimugdha Sharma. Hi,
Yes.
Mani.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening. Manimugdha Sharma is a journalist and an author of the book that I am going to show before you right now. The book is called Allahu Akbar. So I will leave this discussion between Professor Rezavi and Manimugdha. All the very best. And thank you so much for those of you who have joined us already. I can see Vikar Ali and Madhuji have already joined us. So let's hope we have a very fruitful discussion. Thank you so much. Good evening, sir. Over to you.
Uh, well, Friends, welcome to the first program of our season 2. Uh, the Aligarh Society of History and Archaeology represents a group of historians who stand for the dissemination of a scientific and secular interpretation of our past based on primary sources. The group came into existence at a time when attempts from various sides were being made to pass on myths as facts of history and interpret everything which happened in the past with the lens of religion. The biased communal interpretations of the past were being forwarded on a daily basis, and the well established facts were being challenged by circulating tailored views with a communal and political agenda. It was in such a period that some of us resolved to initiate steps to counter this growing trend. Members of this group also realized that in some ways, serious history has been made out of reach for the common people. And that is why they were susceptible to every myth which was being floated. The historians were writing for fellow historians in a language which could not be understood by the masses. The debates were understood and thus followed only by the initiated, the others being left high and dry. And thus we thought of bringing history to the masses. Our first public activity was protesting against the attempt to malign secular history by the incumbent governor of Kerala, who attempted to vitiate the atmosphere during the inauguration of the Indian History Congress session held in 2019 at Kannur. Our press statements and demonstrations were carried by almost all the national dailies and weeklies. It was thanks to the governor of Kerala that Asha came into existence. After a few months' gap, we started our talk and lecture series from early October 2020 onwards. We were lucky to join hands with the Delhi-based group Ganga Jamuni and started a twice a week talk lecture which were held, and as they are being held now, live on YouTube and Facebook. Like the Asha, Ganga Jamni Foundation, as its name suggests, is a group of enthusiasts who want to project our shared culture. They already had a sizable presence on the social media and had been organizing talks and programs reflecting our past cultural traditions and mutual dependencies. The past year or so has seen many series of online talks and lectures, some initiated by well meaning individuals and some by organized groups. Some very tall and well known historians spoke on excellent themes. They all contributed a lot. Some of them were remarkable lectures indeed. But what we realized was that these endeavors lacked a central focus. What was needed was a concerted effort to address those themes which would emphasize our joint efforts and unity. A narrative even of how we ended up what we are today. The lecture series which we started jointly was initiated on 4th of October 2020 with a talk by a Pakistani anthropologist, Dr. Nadeem Omar Tarar, on conserving Gandhara, and it continued without any break for 8 months. The last lecture of this series was delivered on 21st May by Dr. Nandini Chatterjee of University of Exeter. In between, we had many stalwarts like Richard Eaton, Francesca Orsini, Catherine Asher, Supriya Gandhi, Irfan Habib, Harbans Mukhia, Purushottam Agarwal, and many, many others. Our series comprised of 61 talks, lectures, and discussions, and around 50 renowned historians from around the world participated. Our criteria for inviting these scholars was simple. expertise and demonstrable publications in the field, and secular approach towards history. And that they would talk to and address the masses and not talk down to them from a podium of complex jargon. And that is what we achieved. History in a simple and understandable language and backed by primary sources. Almost all the 61 lectures and talks were, however, confined to the field of medieval Indian history. The emphasis on medieval Indian history was primarily due to two reasons. One, the most maligned period from our past has been the medieval phase of Indian history. Our Prime Minister famously declared in 2014 1,000 years of slavery and a dark age when a particular community was discriminated had ended with his coming. Thus, medieval was associated with everything negative and evil. Secondly, most of us at Asha were well conversant and comfortable only in this period. We were all medievalists, having been students of this phase ourselves. And thus it was our comfort zone. We covered many themes, starting from the growth of Vrindavan as a center of Krishna cult from the period of Akbar. We went on to discuss the sources for the study of medieval Indian history. We discussed the Ghaznavites and their sources, the role of the Delhi sultans and regional sultanates in shaping our shared past, the economic, cultural, and social policies of the Mughals, the overarching influences of Sanskrit and Persianate cultures, the role of arts and culture, and even the cementing influences of Bhakti and Sufism. In the end, we also discussed the growth of a common legal system and even the role of cinema in understanding the past. We had to stop due to the raging pandemic around us. But now, fortunately, we are back and resolved to carry on with our endeavors as we did last year. We just need your support. We are living in times when there is a communal and sectarian strife prevailing around us. Attempts to look at our past through the prism of theology, to define our nationalism on the basis of religion, and create heroes of those who actually were cowards, writing humiliating mercy petitions. It is extremely important for us, thus, to remember our real heroes who talked about unity in diversity and taught us to gain knowledge in order to face our real enemies. I mean people like Gandhiji, Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, and Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. Incidentally, all these three, Gandhiji, Akbar, and Sir Syed, were officially born during this month, October, the month when we are re-initiating these talks and lectures. If Akbar preached Sulhul, Gandhiji practiced ahimsa, non-violence, and sang Ishwar Allah Tero Naam Sabko Sammati De Bhagwan. Sir Syed, on the other hand, exhorted the people to look towards Hindus and Muslims as two beautiful eyes of the bride that was India. Unlike V.D. Savarkar, who wrote 6 apologies to his English masters, Sir Syed wrote Asbabe Bagawate Hind to gently remind the English rulers that it was they who were responsible for the Great Revolt not the Indians, not his own Qawm. Like Akbar, he also tried to reach education to his people. Both Akbar and Sir Syed emphasized rational sciences and made them part of their curriculum. We propose that the first few of our episodes are devoted to these three: Gandhiji, Akbar, and Sir Syed. In recent years, three popular books have come out: one in English, one in Hindi, and one in Urdu. Shahenshah Hindustan Jalaluddin Akbar was published from Karachi and written in popular style by Aslam Rahi in Urdu. It is available on the internet. In 2016 was published Akbar, a book written in Hindi by an author who is also a journalist, Shazi Zama. The book was so popular that it was republished in 2019. And then in English, we have Manimugdh Sharma's book, which Shagufta Siddhi just mentioned before you, Allahu Akbar, published in 2019. Today, in our first program, we have with us Mr. Manimugdh Sharma. Welcome, Manimugdh, to our program.
Thank you, sir.
Manimugdh Sharma is a historian by training and a journalist by practice. His book, Allahu Akbar, Understanding the Great Mughal in Today's India, as I said, was published in 2019 by Bloomsbury and is a part biography of Akbar and part commentary on modern day politics in India. It helps a reader make sense of India's medieval and early modern kings who were Muslim by cutting through the modern religion-centric propaganda about them. We are very fortunate that the book was launched at the Center for Advanced Study Department of History, Aligarh Muslim University, 2 years back on October 15, 2019. October 15 being the official date of birth for Akbar. It was inaugurated through the hands of Professor Irfan Habib and in the presence of Professor Shirin Musfi and Rana Safavi ma'am. One of the first reviews of the book was done by another stalwart of medieval Indian history, Professor Harbans Mukhia. He found its style very innovative and he found the narrative to be very charming. Manimugdh Sharma chose journalism as his career and has spent the last 15 years reporting for three national dailies: the Indian Express, the Times of India, and now since a few months, the Hindustan Times. Apart from being a journalist, he has an MA in history. And I am told that he will soon be joining a PhD program at the University of British Columbia at Vancouver, Canada, sometime later this year, where he will also be a fellow at the Institute of Asian Research, School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. Manimugdh's next book is on the Delhi Sultanate, and he also takes a keen interest in military history, where a future work by him can be expected very soon. Today, he will share his experience as a young Indian rummaging through the life and times of a 17th century ruler who was widely loved and respected by his subjects, but is now under a critical lens in the present times. Let us start a discussion with Manimugdh. The first question which I would like to put up before you, Manimugdh, is what made you take up this task of writing on Akbar?
Thank you, Professor Rizavi and Aligarh Society for History and Archaeology for this warm welcome and very, very generous introduction. उस्तादों के सामने उन्हीं के सब्जेक्ट पे बोलने से थोड़ा सा घबराता हूँ, बट क्योंकि उन्हीं लोगों से सीखा है पूरा. So, but since I have been asked to speak on this, so I'll do that. I feel very privileged that my book, I remember discussing the very idea with you when it had just germinated back in 2017, and I had visited the university and had a chat with Professor Irfan Habib as well as Professor Iqtidar Alam Khan about the methodology, the process, and all of that. And it's also interesting that my foray into this academic history also began with Aligarh Muslim University, where under your stewardship in 2017, I had presented a paper in the bicentenary celebration of Sir Sayyid. So it is, I think, a great coincidence that we are speaking in the month when these two stalwarts were born, Sir Sayyid as well as Emperor Akbar. Now, my book resulted from a quest to address the myth-making process about the Mughals, which had started on an industrial scale after 2014. We always knew that the new dispensation that came to power in 2014, they were always very clear that they will not accept Aurangzeb, because for them, he was a bad Muslim. But after 2014, it became clear increasingly that even Akbar was no longer acceptable to them. Akbar, who was, by the way, posited against Aurangzeb as a binary, Akbar being the good Muslim and Aurangzeb being the bad Muslim. So in 2015, it was the then Home Minister, Rajnath Singh, who made a very strange comment, lament rather, that why is only Akbar known as the Great? Why not Rana Pratap? So he had gone to Rajasthan to celebrate the birth centenary of Rana Pratap. So there he made that comment. Rajnath Singh always, as we have seen now over the years, and very recently he has again taken center stage or grabbed headlines by making a very strange comment that it was on Gandhiji's advice that Vinayak Savarkar had written or petitioned the British for mercy for early release. So at that time also he had made this comment, and which of course immediately after that was amplified by the loudspeakers of the ruling party on various media platforms as well as social media. So, and we had, unfortunately, people saying all kinds of things. We had the ruling party spokesperson saying or comparing Akbar with Adolf Hitler. At that time, I thought that this was like stretching it a bit too far.
Mani, let me stop you here. I mean, the question which I asked, and, I mean, what intrigues me is that although you were a journalist, basically by profession, uh, you also dabbled in military history, but that too of Europe. You also had experience as a history consultant for a TV show, but that was on Indian Army. You were also a talking head for a series on National Geographic. It was on World War II. So was it only the prevalent politics, as you were mentioning, which compelled you to shift to the Mughals, or was there something else?
I think it was pretty much the politics which made me think, because I did not intend, honestly speaking, to write a book on Akbar, um, or the Mughals. So, I mean, if I had written a book on the Mughals, it would have been probably something to do with Mughal military systems and Mughal warfare and all that, that sort of a thing. I remember when I discussed this with you, you had also expressed surprise that you probably thought that I would end up writing a book on Mughal military systems. But of course, when this whole politics or the propaganda started, it was quite disturbing because we had all kinds of things appearing in not just social media but also in mainstream media, where opinion pieces were pushed as news pieces by various outlets, and we in the Times of India decided to intervene. So I wrote a few articles. We also did a video. This was very new at that time, doing this YouTube conversations. So this was in 2015 again. So we did a video on this where I was speaking with one of our colleagues. And then I also did another article, a blog piece on the favorite topic of who was greater, was it Rana Pratap or was it Akbar? So, and I explored the journey of Akbar being known as the great to becoming not so great. So it was after that that I didn't know then at that time that my publisher, Bloomsbury, Praveen Tiwari, he was also reading those articles and he found them interesting. So in 2017, we were introduced by a common friend, and then he asked me that, would you like to do a book? And can it be on Akbar? So my first reaction was, well, what will I write about Akbar? Because there's Vincent Smith's book, there's G.B. Mallison's, there have been many articles. There's a book edited by Irfan Saab. Iqtidar Sahab has also written books on Akbar. So what new will I say? So then I thought about it, and then I thought that maybe we should extend this conversation that we had started in the Times of India, and I, on my social media accounts as well, that we need to explore this understanding of Akbar, how to essentially read Akbar and the Mughals and India's medieval and early modern kings, not just the Mughals, the sultans of Delhi, the Mahabanis kings, and in fact, pretty much any Muslim ruler or dynasty of the past, because the politics happens around them and it's very modern. So I decided to write this book exploring this very modern politics around Akbar and the Mughals, and at the same time situate the emperor in his own time and context, and see how this whole politicization of the narrative has begun. And I traced it from the 19th century onwards, how Akbar was seen at that time, and when we come to the 20th century, how his whole image changes. And by the time we come to our own times, the 2020s, we see a very different sort of an Akbar who is no different. When you see the kind of commentary that happens on social media, you would think that this is a tin pot dictator that is being talked about, not an early modern king. An emperor who was compared with, say, the Hindus of the time, who had compared him to as an avatar of Vishnu. So you would think that that sort of a man would be very different. But if you see the modern Akbar that we have in front of us, he is very cruel, very nasty, and he's always against Hindus. And he's always trying to spite the Hindus by doing things that are very unacceptable otherwise. So very
Yeah,
politicized.
yeah, right. Manimugdh, you just mentioned that Akbar during his own period was, taken to be a avatar of Vishnu by certain Hindus who were contemporary to his period. Right. You just pointed that out. But the title of your book is Allahu Akbar, suggesting something else. Can you explain this topic? Because initially, if you remember, at the time when you were getting this book published, there were certain objections to this title.
Right.
How would you justify this title, which invokes religion, for a person who was so anti-religious?
Right. So, as you know, when I was doing my research, I was looking for a title. Being a journalist, you have to have a good title in hand when you think about a story. And my title essentially captures Akbar's ambition, you could say in a way, as well as denial to be seen as a god. Various authors have commented on this in the past. You have a suggestion because when Akbar talks about putting that Allahu Akbar on his seal, there are objections in his court as well. So one courtier, he stands up and says that no, this would convey a very different sort of a meaning if you put this, because your name is also that. So instead of that, instead of putting Allahu Akbar on your coins and your seal, why not La Zikrullahi Akbaru? That would be a more apt and more suitable name, perhaps, or a legend to put on the coins. And Akbar gives a very indignant reaction that who is that fool to suggest that I'm trying to compare myself with God? But you do see that he is trying to, or at least his courtiers are trying to please him every time there's a victory procession which is happening. And Abul Fazl mentions this, that the cry is Allahu Akbar all throughout. Whether it is Ranthambore, whether it is Achitor, even later on, Jalle Jalalehu and Allahu Akbar. So these are the two things which keep coming out. So I decided to play on this because I was also trying to look at him from a very modern perspective. I haven't hidden that at all because that is essentially the message of the book. And we do see that various people at various points in time have also tried to do similar things. And I do the comparison between the Shahenshah of the 16th century and a
yeah. I mean that way. I mean, what you are pointing out, it is through this way that your biography is actually quite extraordinary. I mean, you have chosen a format which not many historians have taken up. I mean, it's really very refreshing. You very easily move from past to the present and back. Why did you decide to resort to this format? I mean, drawing parallels with the present and then going back in time and then from citing some evidence from the past and then coming back to the present. What did you hope to achieve by resorting to this particular tool to understand the past?
Because I thought that the motivations of power have always remained the same. The dimensions have changed. If you, for instance, in the 16th century, if you are a despot and you have an opponent who abuses you publicly or does something which goes against the state, you have the power to extinguish him, take him out of the scene. In the 21st century, you can't do that because there are laws in place. So even if you have the same tendency, you can't do that. So you do the same thing essentially by assassination of character, by enforcement directorate raids, CBI raids. You do something very similar. You achieve something very similar by resorting to these means. So I tried to explore, because essentially that is what a historian does. So people may not admit it, but a historian's present shapes his own understanding of the past. Whether it is a popular author, whether it is an academic historian, we do see that some sort of a present or the understanding of the present always plays a big role. And I wanted to bring this to the fore because the lay reader has to understand that we are not talking about very different people. We are essentially talking about motivations of power. People in power do things to stay in power. Of course, Akbar did not have to fight elections. He did not have some of these compulsions, but he could not antagonize his people just like that, just because he was an absolute monarch. He could not do that. There were certain limitations to his power. And similarly, even in the 21st century, we have democratically elected representatives, heads of state, heads of government, who behave more like 16th century people. But we do have a problem if a 16th century person appears in that comparison as a better person than a 21st century democratically elected leader. So I essentially wanted to explore this, which is why I use that as a tool of storytelling. So people need to understand when they say that, okay, this had happened in the past. And I have tried to show similar things in the present as well. So when, for instance, Allahu Akbar, we do see that his courtiers are trying to appease him in many ways. They are not challenging him. At the same time, we see in the 21st century when our prime minister, who was at that time the prime ministerial candidate of the BJP, he goes to file his candidature in Banaras. Banaras is a very holy town. We see is the town of Shiva, and Har Har Mahadev is the slogan which is very common over there. So we saw his supporters create a new slogan, Har Har Modi, Ghar Ghar Modi. So here Mahadev was replaced by the figure of the prime minister or the prime ministerial candidate at that time. So,
Well, Adi, you are quite right. I'm just stopping you for a moment, and I would like to tell the audience that one of the beauties of this book, Allahu Akbar, is the shifting from past to present and back. Uh, uh, I mean, and the shifting is very smooth. And by doing so, Manimugdh Sharma is able to not only refer to the present rulers of India, but also to analyze their policies. I mean, as he was just now telling us that how Modi and the slogans which were coined around him, in his book, he tries to compare them with the slogans and the activities of Akbar's period. I would want Manimugdh that would you try to elaborate this aspect a little more?
hmm.
How you would use the biography of Akbar to understand the present age political rulers and situations.
So if you have read my book, and my book does not start on the 15th of October 1542 when Akbar was born. My book actually starts on the 10th of October 1941. And I have quoted a Bombay resident, a Hindu named Adi Munshi,
Exactly. Mm.
who writes a letter to the editor of the Times of India, who is essentially complaining about the political situation in the country. He says that the country is falling apart. We need somebody to hold this country together. And so he had at that time the 400th birth anniversary of Akbar in mind. So he decided to use this, write this letter. So it was very enlightening to see the kind of phrases or the terms that he has used for the emperor. He calls him the great Indian soldier, the greatest Indian nationalist, statesman. So these are very modern terms that he uses. And he ends his letter by saying that in these days of domestic discord, communal dissensions, and particularly the Hindu Muslim split, India feels the need for someone like Akbar, the apostle of unity, which I thought was remarkable for somebody in 1941 to say. But he could have easily talked about Gandhi, Nehru, Jinnah, Subhash Chandra Bose, but he talks about Akbar because he thinks that Akbar, someone like Akbar, could have done this difficult task of uniting this very vast and very different country with diverse groups. So you see in that letter a modern understanding of Akbar coming into play. So he is imagining Akbar as a nationalist, the greatest Indian nationalist, in an age when nationalism was current in 1941, but in Akbar's own time we don't see that. Now, of course, we do have right-wing commentators springing up terms like civilizational nationalism being there in India right from Vedic times, which is, I don't understand what that is, but we know that there was no nationalism to of any sort at that time. So I thought that was quite something in 1941 to say, but that also gives us an idea of what people thought about Akbar at that time. Now, you see that before Munshi's time, you had a very contentious political problem spring up in India. Towards the end of the 19th century, you had something called the Gauraksha movement, the cow protection movement, where various groups demanded an official ban on cow slaughter. They appealed to the British government. And it led to some serious communal trouble. So you had riots happening in Bombay, in Burma, and elsewhere in the United Provinces. You had a lot of communal problems. So we see that even in that, when they are talking derisively about the Mughals, by the way, but the Gauraksha movement, people who were pushing this movement, they were writing letters to the district administration in the United Provinces saying that, okay, look, you are our present rulers. You need to follow the example of Emperor Akbar and the Mughals, who actually put a ban on cow slaughter. So you need to follow their path. So it's quite a contrast. I mean, you are talking derisively about the same Mughals in one breath, and then you're also talking positively about them, saying that, okay, since they had done it, you need to do that as well. We see the same thing when the government of India, the new government, when they come in 2014, I think in 2015, they come up with this Namami Gange project, which was a conservation of the Ganga. Now, in their vision document, apart from many other things, they've also said that, as a justification, that the river Ganga was even sacred to the Mughals, and Akbar drank water from the Ganga. That's why there's a need to conserve this, and there's the need to spend this much money on this. So you see that even when they are abusing Akbar or the Mughals, they are also using examples from his time to justify their own current politics. Which is why I thought that maybe it's a good idea to explore that, how the past essentially, or the understanding of the past essentially shapes our present and powers our politics. And that's why I used this tool. I thought it would be a good idea to go back and forth and compare and contrast situations, to see how things have changed over the centuries and how certain things have remained the same. So that was pretty much my approach and methodology. I don't know to what extent I have succeeded. The readers are the best judges.
Right. I mean, Manimugdh, you know, although, I mean, you have given your perspective of Akbar, what you think of him, basing on the forces which you studied. But then in the recent years, there are many Sarkari commentators, both political as well as journalists and anchors. And they have tried to equate Akbar with Hitler. In the last 1 year, Akbar has actually been depicted as a villain. Any comments on that?
Absolutely. I mean, anybody who writes anything about the Mughals, which is not part of the narrative, is immediately dismissed as a jihad sympathizer, an urban Naxal. We have all kinds of terms which are floating around social media. So this is essentially a political project. The British had their own project when they started translating these documents, Persian chronicles in the 19th century. They started putting forward an idea that, this was a cruel medieval past, and the British actually brought enlightenment. So the Hindus were saved from the tyranny of the Muslims. This is what their argument was at that time, to justify their own rule. So they essentially tried to show the Mughals as foreigners, and the fact that Indians had accepted them as their own, therefore they should also accept the British as their own, because as their legitimate rulers, because, well, they have succeeded, the Mughals. So in doing that, they also inspired a whole new generation of authors, not historians, not just historians, but popular authors who actually started to counter this. So we do see this nationalist history emerge, as you very well know, as a reaction to this colonial history, where now this was a secular project where all these medieval and early modern kings had to be presented as part of the larger Indian history, not as foreigners, not as outsiders, but as people who actually added and contributed to the country. That was one project. Now, that was inclusive nationalism, as we call it. Now it is a different thing. Now, because the reactionary forces have seized power now, and they are holding center stage, and they have their own idea of the past. Therefore, people who are aligned, I actually don't like the suggestion that many times people make when they talk about people who are writing for the ruling party, in support of the ruling party, or who are airing their views, echoing their views as paid agents of the ruling party. I think that is a very limiting argument, because we have to also understand that there are ideological motivations here. A new project is on, and it needs to show that every non-Hindu king and dynasty was bad for the country, and therefore you have all these rehabilitation projects also going on of very communal and divisive figures are being projected as national icons, comparable, as if they're on the same level as Gandhi and Nehru and others. So it is in sync with that. So you are trying to create a new idea of India. That's why the constant use of the term New India. Something similar happens in Pakistan as well, where Naya Pakistan is the code word for all kinds of things which are ahistorical, or very difficult to explain, or very difficult to explain logically. In India also, we have this whole New India thing which is happening, and therefore there are participants who are building this project. So it needs to be seen in that context. I don't see any money motivation here, maybe some power motivation, but otherwise I think we need to understand that there are also ideological convictions on the other side, which is what is happening. So Akbar, in their imagination, is a villain. Akbar is also a villain. And I have found this very strange and amusing at the same time, that we have this constant talk about Macaulay Putras and Indians being, there is the need to decolonize the Indian mind. But the people who are talking about decolonization of the Indian mind are also echoing the colonial historiography. They are picking screenshots, extracts, minus their context, and sharing it on social media. And then they are going and telling other people that, no, your mind is colonized. There's a need for decolonization. I mean, look at what people like G.B. Mallison were saying in the 19th century. G.B. Mallison's book on Akbar ends with a remarkable paragraph. I think it's so beautifully written that I would not repeat it here. I would request the audiences to actually go and read that last page if you can't read the whole one. Please, that last paragraph. So it's a very positive thing on Akbar, very ahistorical at the same time. But you see what people like Beveridge, who has translated the Akbarnama, write in the 1930s. So we are into the 20th century now. In 1939, the third volume of the Akbarnama comes out, which H.S. Beveridge has translated. In the preface, he calls Akbar no different from Aurangzeb. He said he is overhyped by people in the preceding generation. And he was very cruel. I don't see any difference between him and various other kings who were very cruel themselves. And even Abul Fazl is cruel. That's what he says, Beveridge. Now, you see, when that is compared, that is colonial historiography again, but of a different generation. But you see the 21st century commentators who are saying the need for decolonization of the Indian mind also say the same thing. So there's a difference. The discipline of history has taken great strides. It has moved beyond these conflicts between dynasties and powers, dynasties and empires. And it has moved into the study of the role of the peasants, the role of the subalterns. There's talk about systems and structures and processes, and the focus has moved away from from individuals. But when you when you hear uh, these commentators talk about the need to change Macaulay Putras or the legacy and all that, you see that there is the 19th century and the early 20th century, which is there at the back of their mind, that kind of historiography, which I think is very interesting. But we need to understand that this is part of a project. And this whole ideology is also inspired by European 19th and early 20th century nationalisms or national movements in Europe. So it draws heavily from that, and therefore it is mirroring that sort of a historiography or that sort of a historical understanding, which is outdated and archaic.
Right, right. Uh, one thing more which I would like to point out, I mean, in support of you, that the modern attempts by the Hindutva forces is basically invocation of the colonial approach, the approach of our colonial masters towards our medieval Indian history, and that is what they are doing. When they attempt to black out the name Akbar Road and replace it with some other name, that is the agenda which they are trying to play out. But on the other hand, uh, if you look at the views of Mahatma Gandhi, I mean, there is Jawaharlal Nehru, who is an ardent admirer of Akbar.
Mhm.
Uh, in his discovery of India, he is all praise for Akbar and his policies. But on the other hand, Mahatma Gandhi, uh, although uh, he praises Akbar, but he qualifies it. I mean, in one of his speeches, which Mahatma Gandhi had delivered at Johannesburg in 1916, which is there in the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi. There, he says that some of the Muslim rulers, people like Akbar and some others, were influenced by the Hindu rationalistic philosophy and thus turned into what Akbar actually did turn into. How would you respond uh, to this view of Mahatma Gandhi? That Akbar actually became a proponent of, pacifism only after his interactions with the ancient Hindu philosophy. I mean, that is something which is also reflected in some of the modern Bombaya films. For example, Jodha Akbar. I mean, same type of thing, that it is only after when a barbarian Akbar comes into contact with the Rajput family, when he comes into contact with Jodhabai, it is Jodhabai who keeps on telling him how to act, and ultimately, because he is in love with Jodhabai and the influence of Rajputs is there, so suddenly, I mean, Akbar, uh, you know, starts changing his policies. This was something which Gandhiji had also alluded way back in 1916. How would you react to this after having written a biography of Akbar?
Well, you know this very well, sir, that Akbar actually, before marrying these Hindu women, he had actually ended this pilgrimage tax. And Zazia in 1563. So you see that this has happened even before he has married these Rajput. The first Rajput woman is, of course, Harkhabai or Hir Kanwar, whom he marries in 1564, I think. But his scrapping of this policy is happened even earlier. So yes, it's he was in this country in Hindustan. He had seen all kinds of people and he had a very remarkably open mind, as you know. He was questioning everything, and in his earlier part, very early on, he is not the Akbar that we know him as today. He was like any other king, perhaps, but it's his personality was changing, and that's how a good person should be. I mean, somebody who's interesting, somebody who's charming. His views were different when he was 13, when he becomes the emperor. His views are different somewhat when he's 23, and when he's 33, when he's 43. You see that. I mean, only after 1579, that's another different phase of Akbar's life, where we see some remarkable things again. So it is a constant evolution. We cannot say that only because he came in contact with the Hindus, that's why he became a very remarkable sort of a man. Yes, that definitely played some part in it. But we ignore the fact that these people already had a high culture. They belonged to a high culture. They came from Central Asia. They had their own understanding of the world. They drew from the rich, the Timurid heritage, and as well as the Mongol as part of it, Yasa and all that. So this was already there in their repertoire. And the fact that there were a lot of exchanges happening with Iran as well. So all these ideas were free flowing. He comes at a time when there has already been a Bhakti movement and a Sufi movement. So these ideas were already there. There were the ideas of Kabir, which were there, which were very extant at that time. So, and we see in Akbar's own life that he was interacting with the Jains, he was interacting with people, with the Christians, the Jesuit padres. He was very devotional towards the Sufis, and so in fact, Abul Fazl lists so many different categories of people with whom he was having his interactions at the Ibadat Khana. There are Sabians, there were Jewish people, there were Brahmins, there were Jains. So all kinds of people were there. So he was definitely getting ideas from everywhere. And that's how your personality evolves. I mean, you don't live in isolation. You live in an open, in a society where ideas are free-flowing. He drew heavily from the Persians, the Safavid tradition of the Pir o Murshid. It comes directly and influences him as well. So the Sulh-e-Kul is a Sufi concept. So of course, Bapu was also doing his political project at that time. So, and his understanding was not of a historian. We have to understand that. But it was not a negative view on Akbar. So he said that, okay, he was Indian because, all these things happen. Nehru has a different view on Akbar. Not like Gandhi. And various other people have also. I think Jinnah in his 11th August speech, he talks about the need for Akbar, a system of Akbar to be continued in the new nation of Pakistan. So that understanding of Akbar was there. I mean, he was a loved historical character at that time. Enough had been written about him. But there was also, as somebody pointed out in a comment, that this hate for Akbar is not new. It also had started at that time. Yes, there were Hindi authors who were writing derisively about Akbar. But at the same time, we have to see that some of these stories which came from Rajputana, from Todd's annals. So some of these stories, like the Rakhi story, the Humayun being sent a Rakhi, is a story which comes from Todd's Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan. So here, the Mughal emperor is not portrayed as a villain. He is somebody whom the Queen of Chittor actually sends a Rakhi to. It may be a story, but it still doesn't show the Mughal emperor as a villain. But today, you have a very different view coming from these same groups. So I think it is incorrect to say that it's only because he was influenced by Hindus. That's why we have such an eclectic personality in Akbar. I think a lot of influence also came from Islam. I mean, he got his whole Ibadat Khana concept from Suleiman Karrani. When he goes to Bengal, he sees that Suleiman Karrani was having similar interactions. So he was very impressed by that, and he decides to introduce that. So he was a very Indian king, a millennial sovereign, a philosopher king. He had his own traditions to borrow from Persia, from Turan. So these were from the central lens of Islam. So we cannot ignore that. It's a mix.
In your support, I will cite one more evidence, Manimugdh, and that is that way back in 1562, when he was yet under the influence of Mahamanaga. He was yet to marry any Rajput princess. In fact, even his first marriage had not taken place.
Mhm.
At that time, when the episode of Adam Khan took place, probably you and the audience remember that Adam Khan tried to defy what young Akbar had been saying, and he also tried to attack the foster,
Yeah.
father
Shamsuddin.
of
Yeah.
Akbar
Mhm.
within the palace complex. And when Akbar heard the commotion, he came out. There's a famous story goes that when he saw that his foster uh, father had been killed by Adam Khan, Akbar rushed to um, face Adam Khan. Adam Khan was, in fact, knocked down and then ultimately ordered to be thrown uh, from the ramparts of the palace. Now, one of the painters of the Akbarnama, the illustrated Akbarnama, which we have in the Victoria Albert Museum, one of the illustrators has this image of Akbar throwing down Adham Khan from the terrace, ordering the throwing down, not himself, but asking the servants. The others are throwing down Adham Khan, and Akbar is standing there watching. And what is remarkable in this painting is this very early painting is that Akbar is shown wearing a dhoti, an Indian dress. Now, it is a time when Akbar is yet to come into contact. Granted that this painting might have been made later on, but the type of Indian influence which was there on Akbar is very much visible in these paintings which were made during the lifetime of Emperor Akbar himself. So, just to support you, that it is not only the influence of the women of the court, the influence was coming from elsewhere. Secondly, if you look at the language of Abul Fazl in Akbarnama, he uses many a Hindavi terms in that. So, I mean, it's not only the ideas borrowed from the Rajputs, but let us not forget that Akbar himself was born in
At
a
the house of.
Rajput household.
Mhm.
I mean, his influences probably were coming from there as well. His childhood, his initial days were spent in a Rajput gharana. Let us not forget that. So, Akbar, as you rightly pointed out, is a very complex personality. But on the other hand, uh, you know, since day one, there have been a lot of Muslim critiques of uh, Akbar, who have been very critical of Akbar's soft handling of the Hindu subjects. During the contemporary period, who doesn't know about Mullah Abdul Qadir Badai? There are other references also. I mean, due to shortage of time, I won't refer to all of them. Uh, Along with that, in the contemporary period, or from 19th century onwards, and ultimately during the 20th century, at a time when India gained independence, and then after independence, when Pakistan was created as an independent nation, even from prior to the creation down to the present moment, Akbar remained an anathema as far as the Pakistan was concerned. In fact, till 1990s, uh, Akbar was not even included in the syllabus of the students in Pakistan, schools and colleges. Something which now is going to take place in India. If you look at the uh, uh, modern changes which are supposed to be brought out by the UGC under this present dispensation, any reference to Akbar is now gone. You know, likewise, in Pakistan, even prior to its establishment, down to the present age, Akbar is in fact an anathema, someone who gave too many concessions to the Hindus and thus harmed the cause of Islam. Now, when I was introducing you, before that, I mentioned a book, Shahenshah Islam Akbar. It's in Urdu, it's a very general book, very brief, around 152 or 160 pages or so. Uh, very easy chapters, easy for the students to read. The title is very interesting. Shahenshah Islam, the Islamic king, Akbar. But if you read it, there is a whole chapter devoted to the fact that the author, in fact, throughout 15-20 pages, keeps on bemoaning the fact and belittling Akbar that he had denigrated Islam by pandering to the Hindu interests. In fact, Mehzar, the Ibadat Khana discussions which you mentioned, all of them are mentioned as something which harmed the cause of Islam. How would you react to this interpretation of Akbar from the perspective of the Muslim communists? Throughout your book, you have been referring to the Hindutva elements. But what about these Islamic Hindutva elements which have been, extremely rightist and critical of Akbar? What would you tell them? What would be your reaction?
So, when one of my Pakistani friends shared the cover of my book, that this is the book on Akbar which is coming out, there was immediately a lot of negative reaction which came from people who were friends with him. They said, this is a heretical king. Why should we read a book about him? He destroyed Islam. He started Deen Ilahi, which was a different faith. Islam se farik ho gaye the, ye kar diya, kharij kar diya Islam ko. So all kinds of things were being said. So I think Akbar, in his own lifetime, and as it is evidence from not just what Mullah Abdul Qadir Badayuni is writing, but even people like Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi. So he was getting a pushback from the ulema, from the very religious-minded Muslims of his court and even in his empire. So and he had to at times really come down hard on them. But of course, to suggest that he was, yes, there are certain things about Akbar which may be a bit hard for a very orthodox-minded Muslim to digest. For instance, when he questions the prophetic tradition in open court, and Badayuni seethes with rage that the emperor is actually questioning the splitting of the moon, or this whole Miraj tradition of the Miraj, and in fact he blames it on Shias and Hindus, that they have led him astray. The emperor is, so you see, in that way it's very similar to many of these right-wing people today who say that there's a lot of appeasement of most minorities which is going on. The Congress has done a lot of appeasement of the minorities. You write a book in a certain way, that means appeasement of minorities. This is what essentially Badayuni also says, that he is appeasing his Hindu wives and courtiers by talking derisively about Islam. Badayuni also says that he, in fact, forced some of these guards in the palace to change their more Muslim sounding names. And even Islam, I think, is referred to as Ahmadi Kesa by Abu Fazl. So, even though earlier we see that there was a tradition of referring to whenever there's an army going from Delhi, it's referred to as the Lashkar-e-Islam. But now here we have the emperor who's leading an army, who is in court, and his court historian or his court chronicler is not even calling it Islam. So yes, there were things about certain things which really upset the orthodox-minded people. But Akbar was also doing a political project. We have to understand that. So there were compulsions that he had, and there were many things that he was accused of which he did not do. He would, in fact, hear bazaar gossip about things that he was supposedly doing in his palace. For instance, there's also some alternative to the kalma that Badayuni accuses him of coming up with and circulating it within the palace. That's the only source that talks about it. There's no other source that mentions that. So all kinds of rumors were being spread, I think, and we know the type of that because we see something similar happen even today. So, like I said, the motivations of power and how the way certain things have happened in the past have remained the same even in our times. So there was a lot of scandal which was happening, but Akbar was pragmatic in the sense that he had an objective in mind. He was creating a super state, and which had a majority non-Muslim population, so they had to be taken on board. You could not have antagonized everyone and run his empire. So he was including everyone. At the same time, he was not willing to subject his rational thinking to the dogmas of faith. So we have to understand this as well about him. So you see that he is saying things, doing things. He's following codes and tenets of different other faiths. He's performing home and havans like Hindus do. He is doing Surya Namaskar. He is chanting 1,000 names of the sun god, which he learned from the Jains. And there's also fire worship, which is happening like the Zoroastrians. So he is, and that way it's a very many Indian later let's say prime ministers have also done something similar. Even today they do. If you go to a mazar, you go to a temple, many of our political leaders, chief ministers, prime ministers have done that. Essentially it's a tradition which is continued. So you have to show respect to other faiths as well. Akbar does it in a very different way, of course. He adopts so many other things, and I think he was that only shows that he had a very curious mind. But he doesn't go against Islam that way. I don't think that accusation holds true because as we see when we look at the so-called Tawhid-e-Ilahi, which is presented as a different religion, we see that it actually conforms to the tenets of Islam. So there's no clergy, there's no priesthood there. So I don't see why we need to believe what many of these orthodox voices had said at that time to go on rejecting Akbar. I think it's a very remarkable man to do such things in the 16th century when at the same time his contemporaries in Europe were persecuting people from other faiths. I mean, Elizabeth in England was persecuting Catholics. You look at the Inquisition, which was happening in Spain, in Goa. You look at what the Safavids were doing, forcibly converting Sunni population into Shia, and look at what the Ottomans did to their Christian population. So the Mughals were very different that way. So I think Akbar is a reflection of that. I don't see any need to really respond to that on religious lines there.
Well, Manimugdh, I have asked most of my questions. I see before me that there are a number of questions put up by the audience as well. But before I start uh, asking you to answer those questions, just one last comment from you. How far do you think that Akbar is relevant to present day India? Is he relevant?
Well, he is, and that is the most unfortunate part of our times, that a 16th century king is relevant today, because we are constantly attacking his legacy, his name, his faith, all that he stood for, which is why people who were, let's say, they knew about Akbar, but they were not very curious about what exactly he did. So that person will also find, will also be attracted, or let's say he'll be willing to find out something about Akbar. Now that so much attack has been happening. The other thing, of course, is uh, he was talking about bringing his subjects of different faiths on the same platform. Don't you think that is also very modern in a sense? Because here we have examples of kings who are openly persecuting their minorities, and this man is talking about bringing everyone on the same platform. So I think that is very remarkable. Before this, we do see sometimes in the poetry of, say, Amir Khusro, that thought, Har Qaum Rast Rahe. So that thought comes in the poetry, but not in the expression of a king who is talking about things about Sulhekul and bringing everyone together on the same platform. That is, I think, very modern in a sense, because that's what modern nation states are supposed to do for their citizens. Unfortunately, what is happening is that we have not been able to go beyond Akbar's articulation of tolerance, of peaceful coexistence. So essentially, the Indian idea of secularism is essentially an articulation of Akbar Sulhekul. So we have not been able to go beyond that and introduce a very European style secularism in our country. So we still believe in the same things, maybe a bit different, but essentially it's the same articulation which continues even today. And he will be even more relevant because now we have a saffron Shahenshah who is showing all the mannerisms of a despot, of a 16th century, 17th century despot. So therefore, the comparisons will be obvious. So I think that way also he will be very relevant. But I think giving people dignity is something that he did. He talked about ending slavery. He talked about ending sati. He actually did. Personally, there are instances when he rides a horse and stops a widow from being burned on the fire. He did so many things which were very remarkable for his time, but essentially he was still a 16th century man. So, I mean, in a 21st century democracy, a 16th century king should not have been relevant, but such as our times, that he will continue to be relevant because that is one king who will always be talked about along in the same vein as Ashoka. The Indian state adopted the symbols of the Mauryan Empire. And it has continued. Jawaharlal Nehru writes this whole tribute to Emperor Akbar. So these will always be the figures who will continue to be relevant, because here they are talking to their subjects as a father talks to children. So the large presence, of course, if Akbar had the technology back in his time, he would have also perhaps painted his face on every poster and the things that we definitely associate with modern times. So I guess, yeah, his relevance is there.
To the last comment, I would just say that probably he would not have put his own, portraits on the posters, because if you look at the Akbarnama paintings, uh, he has asked his painters to depict him as he was with all his defects. So he has that mole. The mole has not been removed. Whenever he's shown walking with a tilt. He's never shown wearing gaudy clothes. He's always simply clothed. So I don't think that he was that great a megalomaniac as far as his own representation was concerned as the present rulers are. Right. Now let us start having the questions from the public. And I am sure that there are a number of questions. Here is your first question. Ali Haider has asked this question. Do you think Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, being lawgiver, could have played any role in influencing Mahzar declaration of Akbar, which he did in 1579? Or did he do it on his own?
Okay, so I'll tell you what I think about this. Akbar was competing against the Ottomans as well. It's very clear. And it had started even before that, because he was patronizing the Sharifs of Makkah. He was sending donations, and he was trying to show that essentially, the caliph is in a caliph in his own territory, but he's also, and we see that in the letter by Humayun, which was actually sent back, because by the time Humayun was in a position to send out the letter, he had already died. So it was actually Akbar who sends that letter through this Ottoman admiral, I think Siddi Reis. So he sends this letter and congratulates the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan, and says nice things about him, that, okay, you are the Caliph, the Khalifa, and of your territory, but here we have also established our Khilafah. So we are also on the same plane. So this idea was pretty much there at the back of Akbar's mind. So you see that he in fact finances the Hajj trips for his subjects, and the sheriffs of Mecca found it really interesting because it opened for them a way to not always bow to the writ of the Ottoman Sultan. That there was also a parallel authority which was there in Hindustan. So people who were coming, and which is why I think in one of the later voyages, the Ottoman Sultan gets so insecure that he forces the Mughal Hajj caravan to return abruptly from Mecca, because the complaint was that they were staying back. And the reason that was given was that water and other resources were running short. That's why they had to return. So they did not give the precise reason, but it is very clear that the Sultan was getting insecure. And he was always worried that the Mughals would tie up with the Portuguese and would influence, or let's say attack, the Ottoman vessels or the Ottoman trade which is happening in the Arabian Sea, in that part. So they were competing authorities. In later time, we see in Aurangzeb's time, I think after the reverse in Vienna, outside the gates of Vienna, the Ottoman Sultan actually asks Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb for a loan of rupees 9 lakh. And so you see that he's also trying to influence or keep the Mughal emperor in good books, because the Mughals were very powerful at that time, and there were the Safavids in between. So you see that very often you would have emissaries which are being, because Jahangir, I think, had received a request from the Ottomans to ally against the Safavids. The Uzbeks, who were still a very, very much powerful, they were also, so essentially it's a Sunni versus a Shia state. So that was also happening. So the Mughals played a very important role in that politics. Later on, of course, during Aurangzeb's time, we see that because of his wars in the Deccan, so that thing was no longer there. So they were no longer exerting as much influence in Mecca as they did in Akbar's time. But Akbar was going out with the intent. It was very strong, because the concept of the whole Padishah, he was also a Padishah. Padishah-e-Jahan, the Ottoman Sultan, called himself Padishah-e-Jahan. Here he was also calling himself a Padishah. The Safavid was also a Padishah. So they were all, but the Safavid king was not looking for leadership of the Sunnis. The Mughal emperor and the Ottoman Sultan, they were. So I think he could have played a role, but Akbar was not just, Mahzar is just one element. It had started much before. The moment Akbar comes to the throne, we see 1564, 1565 is the time when he sends his missions, his emissaries to Mecca. So that thing was pretty much there. So, and here he is in 1579. He's trying to unite the offices of the ulema. He calls himself Imam Adil and Amirul Mominin. So these are again titles which mirror the Ottoman Sultan. At least Imam Adil, Amirul Mominin is what he used to call himself, the Ottoman Sultan. So it's really these two rival claimants. The Ottomans, by virtue of their control over Mecca, they had that title. And the Mughals, of course, they never challenged him directly in the sense that they never rejected him. So you would find that even in their letters, they're calling him the Khalifa. But every attempt is being made to ensure that, okay, you are Khalifa of your own lands, but here we are pretty much ruling, or we have established the Khilafat in our lands. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you are quite correct, Manimugdh. I mean, I would add to what you are saying. Ali Haider Saab, uh, thank you first of all for being always present in our programs. I think out of the 61 lectures which we had held last year, there was hardly any which you had missed. And you had also put up questions there, and I'm really thankful that you have joined us once again. I also keep on enjoying your posts and
Same
your
here.
comments, which
Same
you keep on putting up. Quite learned and good comments which you keep on putting up.
And also, thank you for the tags on every Facebook post.
Yeah.
Very important ones.
Ali Haider Saab, don't forget, as Manimugdh pointed out, that the Mughals and the Ottomans were actually rivals of each other. When the Uzbek ruler wrote to Akbar that Akbar, the Mughals, should form an alliance with Uzbeks and the Ottomans against the Persians, who are in fact heretics. They are stopping the Hajj, and let us join hands to punish these so-called, what is the term for these, not infidels, but there is a particular term which I am forgetting, which was being used for the Shias at that particular moment of time. But the reply which Akbar gave is very interesting. Very politely, he rebuffed the idea by pointing out two things. One, that number one, the Safavids, they might be Shia, but they belong to the family of the Prophet. And thus, Akbar cannot go against them. Secondly, he pointed out that as far as infidels are concerned, as far as the obstruction to the way of Hajj is concerned, he is already fighting against the Portuguese. So there is no need to fight against the Ottomans. So there was an opportunity for Akbar to assert his Sunni authority. He did not. Time and again, he did not do that. Then, when the Mahzar was drafted, apparently, he was trying to take up the leadership of the Sunni Muslims. That is how Mahzar has been interpreted. But pay attention to the various clauses of the Mahzar. Akbar is trying to take up the power of ijtihad, which is not there in the Sunni world at all. Ijtihad is something which is closed among the Sunnis. But Akbar declares himself as the Mujtahid. The very concept of Imam Adil. Imam Adil is not a term or is a concept derived from the Ottomans at all. It is a concept derived from the Safavids. the pious Imams of the Shiites. Akbar cannot declare himself that, but he wants to take up a similar position. The problem with Akbar or the Mughals was that actually, in fact, they could neither declare themselves as the Sunni Khalifa nor they could declare themselves as the Imams, because after all, both the Shias and Sunnis were in a pathetic minority in India as they still are. The majority of the populace over which he was ruling would not be affected whether he became the Khalifatul Muslimin or whether he became the Imam Adil. So remember this fact. And Akbar was very conscious of that. So actually, Ali Haider Saab, Akbar never tried to take up these positions at all. Akbar never tried to align with the Ottomans as such. He kept on playing with those powers. The only intention of the Mughals, including Akbar, was to safeguard their own territory. And I don't think that in any way the Ottoman philosophy had any role to play as far as the Mughal polity was concerned. So I don't think that the Mahzar of 1579, as it is, the Mahzar of 1579 was drafted by a name, by a person who was Abul Fazl, Abul Fazl's father, who was a Mahdavi, not a Hanafi Sunni Muslim who would have been under the influence of the Ottomans. So this is the short answer which I would give, and I would assure you and the others who are watching this program that as far as Manimugdh's references to Ibadat Khana are concerned, surely we would be holding a different program on that where we would be analyzing those things. Can we have the second question? The other question, Muhammad Aftab Alam, how do you view the attempts in drawing a parallel between the life of the Prophet and Akbar, particularly receiving mystical light by their foster mothers and other incidents as narrated by Shazi Zaman in his book Akbar? Was it an attempt to exalt him to a mystical position?
Okay, this is very interesting. So, Ummi, as they say, somebody who learned things, had the divine light, figured things out on his own. I think in Akbar's case, it was more a play on Amir Temur, where the attempt was made to show him, because Amir Temur supposedly was not a man of letters, supposedly had not learned, but man of very high culture, obviously, but not lettered. And Akbar was also shown as, you see that Sahib-e-Kiran usually refers to, Lord of the Conjunction usually refers to Amir Temur, but in Akbar's case also, and Shah Jahan though even calls himself Sahib-e-Kiran Esani. But the Sahib-e-Kiran reference keeps coming in Akbar's life as well, even in his chronicles. And so you see that an attempt was definitely made to show him. And I think Professor Rezavi also presented a paper on this at the Indian History Congress, where this whole thing about Akbar being illiterate was a new light. Was he highlighted the fact that Akbar actually could read and write, and there are writing samples of Akbar which are available. So I am not too sure if if a conscious attempt was made to equate him with the Prophet, even though Badauni does talk about it, that he even was rejecting the Prophet, and apparently Badauni says that he hated the Prophet for saying that he was the last Prophet, because the Prophet said he was the last, therefore the emperor could not declare himself a prophet. So that's what Badauni says. But whether there was a conscious attempt to show him as somebody like the Prophet? I'm not too sure. I cannot answer that question. But yes, definitely, I have understood it as a play on Amir Temur's legacy, because to show him as someone as great or even greater than Amir Temur, the Sahib Quran reference definitely was used, because he was also their ancestor. They considered him to be their ancestor, and Amir Temur was somebody who figured things out on who was unlettered, and that's why this whole myth was probably created. But I think Professor Rezavi can give a better response on this.
I mean, to an extent, I would agree with Shaji Zaman uh, that Akbar did try to uh, appropriate certain, you know, certain, images which actually belong to the Prophet. Um, for example, which you referred, and I had written a paper on that, and I had also made a presentation in the season one of these talks on how literate or illiterate Akbar was. So in that talk, as well as in my paper, I had tried to show that Akbar very consciously wanted to project himself just like the Prophet, and that is why his courtiers use the term Ummi for him. The term Ummi in the Sunni world is used for the Prophet to mean that a person who was illiterate, who did not get educated. Akbar also and his courtiers also invoke the same type of word. Although we have references that not only Akbar was himself a versifier, not very great, but still he could. He was also a versifier. He could read. He could write. He was not in the habit of. I mean, sometimes people stress that he was an Ummi, and that is why texts were read before him. So texts were read even before Jahangir. Text that was a tradition during that period, that most of the emperors would not read themselves, but text would be read to them. So that was no specialty of Akbar. Uh, so that was being done for other rulers as well. But we have evidences that Akbar could read, he could write, and he was not actually in the literal sense an illiterate, yet the term Ummi is being used for him because he is trying to position himself in a similar fashion. As Manimugdh just pointed out some time back, that Islam is never referred to as Islam throughout the writings of Abul Fazl, which is being vetted by Akbar himself. It is Keshe Muhammadi. So Muhammad is an individual who comes up with a philosophy. Similarly, Akbar is a personality who is coming up with a philosophy. So let it. Uh, so if there is a Keshe Muhammadi, there is a tradition of Akbar. They are disciples of Akbar who are to do this, who are to do that. Although it was never successful, but in his mind he was trying to ape that. But on the other hand, uh, you know, uh, he was also trying to get inspired not only from Prophet Muhammad, but also from a tradition which was purely un-Islam, and that is the Changezid tradition. I mean, for example, the mystical light which Aftab Alam is talking about, the Farre Izadi,
Yeah.
the light emanating from God, derived from the Ishraqi philosophy, is Muslim philosophy, all right. But Akbar, in his way, it back to Changiz Khan. Abul Fazl, in the very opening passage of the Akbar Nama, where he is introducing the king, the kingship as such, he invokes the myth of Ellen Koa, the grandmother of
Yeah.
Genghis Khan, how she was impregnated in a similar fashion as Mother Mary, divine
Light.
concept. And just like Mother Mary was the mother of Jesus, the Son of God. Alan Khoa is the mother of three sons of God, one of whom is the father of Genghis Khan. And Abul Fazl very clearly mentions that this light kept on transferring from womb to womb, and that is not nothing Islamic. This is a pre-Islamic character, and that divine light which Genghis Khan had within him, because he was the son of a god, sun god, that divine light kept on transferring womb to womb until and unless it reached the womb through which Akbar was. Right? So, Akbar, in order to, you know, build up his own kingship, is taking the help of many sources. The prophetic tradition is one of them. Next question, please. If somebody will ask you who was better administrator, Sher Shah Suri or Akbar, then what would be your answer? Also, how Mughal emperors after Akbar remembered Akbar in their memory? As far as I know, even Aurangzeb remembered him in good words.
Okay, so see, Shesha was around.
Minimum, let us be brief. I mean, we have
Okay,
crossed the
right.
time limit. I am also speaking too much, and please let us confine.
Okay, so it's very difficult to answer this simply because Shesha was around just for 5 years as the ruler, and he did institute certain things, certain measures and yardsticks which were adopted and continued and improved upon by Akbar. So Akbar had a much longer career, 49 years as emperor, so a very longer career to be an administrator. So clearly, I think that comparison would not be apt. Shesha was very good uh, at taking opportunities and taking them to the next level. He was a survivor essentially. And Akbar, obviously, also because his father had almost lost everything when he died, and there was this great threat which was facing him in the form of Hemu when Akbar took over the reins of power. So he actually literally built, or let's say rebuilt, the empire from scratch. So in a way, I think there is often a very unfair comparison made, and now, of course, it ties into the nationalist rhetoric which we keep on hearing that no, Shesha would have been a greater king and all that. Uh, Now we don't know that, do we? So I mean, just have a very tiny period to compare with a huge 49 period where Akbar was the monarch. So I think any kind of an answer would be very unfair to both individuals. That sort of an answer. Secondly, uh, how Akbar was remembered, I think immediately during the rebellion, I think when Jahangir had rebelled against his father, and then he writes letters and issues proclamations where certain things he promises to reverse some of the policies of his father. So you have that on record, and he actually blames his father for certain un-Islamic deeds. But later on, we see in his own Tuzuk, and he remembers his father very fondly, and he describes. I mean, the best description of Akbar actually comes from Jahangir, the physical description, that is his voice being very loud and his build being that of a lion and all of that. And no emperor could have rejected their own ancestor. I mean, we have to remember that as well. That even Aurangzeb could not have rejected Akbar entirely. That I think um, is something that was there all throughout.
Mirza Hussain, I would add to what
Hmm.
you said. I'm sorry. I'm going to add, Shagufta. I'm very, very sorry that I am also answering, in spite of the fact that Manimugdh has answered. But let me also put in my word.
It's always
And
interesting.
had if someone asked me who is a better administrator, like Manimugdh, I would also say that I'm not sure. But remember that the entire revenue administration of Akbar was based on the revenue administration as conceived by Sher Shah Suri. But also remember the fact that the revenue administration of Sher Shah was further fine tuned and given a better shape so that it continued for such a long time. But had Sher Shah not been there, this would not have been possible. Number two, the type of road networks which Sher Shah had come up with definitely helped, later rulers, including Akbar.
Hmm.
So, point number one, that Sher Shah, as Manimugh says, had a very short time, but within that short period of time, he proved his mettle. He was a good administrator, and there are certain aspects of his administration which were very perceptive. Uh, Secondly, as far as remembrance is concerned, don't forget that even Aurangzeb issued, a parwana as a prince to Rana Raj Singh, in which he invoked the policy of Sulekul of his forefather Akbar. So the continuities are very much there. Now, uh, Shreyashi Sarkar asked, in reality, when we go, uh, the question has
I think
changed.
I saw the parts of the question. I think she was asking to what extent do movies shape our understanding of Akbar. I think that's what she had asked. If I
Do
can.
you consider him
That's
as an
great.
emperor of secular India?
Okay, so secular, liberal, these are all very modern terms that we apply retrospectively. But surely an effort towards this was made. I mean, the first step was definitely taken in his time. Secularism actually means separation of the church from the state. So uh, that way, he did make a beginning. But as we understand secular India, that is a very different connotation, and it's a very modern label that we should not really apply retrospectively on the 16th century, because it was an absolute monarchy, and it always depended on the goodwill of a monarch. I mean, it was always a matter of chance, really. I mean, you could have a great king, or you could have an absolutely terrible king. So, in this case, I think people were fortunate that there was somebody like Akbar, and very rare at that. I mean, somebody so remarkable and very different. The other thing about, of course, movies, they play a very important role. I think when I was growing up, the image of Akbar, even today, in my mind, is of Prithviraj Kapoor, because I saw Mughal-e-Azam as a child, and people who were born after 2008, for them the name Akbar would throw up the image of Hrithik Roshan, perhaps, because they saw that movie Jodha Akbar in 2008. So movies do play a very important role, and I think largely today Indians have a very positive view about the Mughals, despite all this rhetoric on social media, despite all these slur and smear campaigns against the Mughals and Akbar, which come straight from the top. Despite all that, people are still largely, they have a positive understanding of the Mughals, despite all this. And that is largely because of one movie, Mughal Azam, K. Asif's Mughal Azam. Uh,
Shreyashi's question was a little different. I mean,
okay.
I have it here before me. She says that the students generally only watch the movies and get their impression about history from movies
Hmm.
instead of going and reading the books. They just need notes through which to study or see the movies.
Hmm.
Seriously, I would just say that, movies are a good source, as Manimugdha Sharma says, in understanding the past. But the problem with the movies is that it iron out all other interpretations of the past.
Hmm.
Only one version remains, the version which is being depicted. So that is why it is used by a large number of people for propaganda. Hmm. Nazis use this for a particular propaganda. In the present period, the image of Alauddin Khilji was shown as a savage due to a certain propaganda. Now, ask the children, Alauddin Khilji, who came up with market control measures, agrarian measures, so on and so forth. But to the people who have seen that movie Padmavat, Alauddin is a savage and nothing more. I would
Hmm.
just suggest to you that there are certain very good textbooks which I think should be read. Without reading them, a proper understanding of history cannot be found. So please pay attention. And next week we are going to I'm going to deliver a lecture on movies. So if possible, join it. I'll be talking about this issue. Next question, please. Next question. Nidin Olikara.
Hmm.
How did Akbar reconcile the rules of Islam to his very unorthodox acts? Were there contemporary ulama who wrote favorably about him and marked this act as not being non-Islamic?
Yeah, there were people who were favorable. In fact, uh, Abdul Qadir Badayuni actually laments that many senior ulema have actually not resisted the emperor's so-called heretic ways, and they have allowed the emperor to go on doing things like he has. So there were people uh, who supported him, or let's say if they didn't support him, they at least did not resist him. But there were a lot of others as well who resisted him at every step, and Akbar came down very heavily on them. There were revolts because of that, and even the 1579 that Nama also created a lot of controversies. So, how did Akbar reconcile the rules of Islam to his very unorthodox act? Well, the very fact that he was unorthodox. I mean, he understood religion in his own way. He was, and I think every sultan of Delhi has had problems because there was a very rigid interpretation of what he should do of Islam, and a king cannot always go by the tenets of the faith. I mean, you are not a religious scholar.
Nidhin, just remember that no medieval ruler was un-Islamic.
Hmm.
All of them believed in Islam.
Hmm.
All of them were faithful rulers. Number one.
Hmm.
It is only the thing that how they treated their subjects.
Hmm.
None of them was anti-religion. We are not, we are talking about 16th, 17th centuries, and the present definitions of secularism and
Hmm.
atheism does not apply
Exactly.
to that period of time. So Akbar was equally religious as was
Hmm.
Aurangzeb. The only thing is that Akbar tried to share power with
Hmm.
other religions, Aurangzeb did not.
Hmm.
It's a whole discussion on which we can have later on because we are short of time. I'll ask Shagufta to put up the question by Mukul. Was abolishing jizya a move to consolidate empire or something else? And how do you interpret Aurangzeb's reinstating jizya?
Hmm. Okay. So it was definitely a consolidation of the empire. That is one of the reasons. Secondly, he himself, I think there's a, as Abul Fazl quotes him when he's removing both the pilgrimage tax and later on the Zazia. Uh, Akbar definitely wanted certain customs which had been prevalent at that time, followed as some sort of a tradition. Nobody questioned it. Non-Muslims paying Zazia. So he wanted to get rid of that because it was obviously a point of conflict. I mean, it was something that people who were paying that tax it was a way of subjugation, wasn't it? So he was trying to get rid of that because he also wanted to pacify the Hindus, and immediately after that, you see that all these Rajputs start coming in, and there are other Hindus who have joined his court, and they become very loyal subjects. But he does bring it back, and again abolishes it. So we, I think, pay too much emphasis uh, on this Jizya aspect. It was very crucial, obviously. Aurangzeb's reinstating Jizya was as much a financial means as it was religious. He was playing, but he does it 20 years after he has become the emperor, Aurangzeb. He does not do it immediately. So there were concerns and there were considerations that were there at the back of his mind in Aurangzeb's case, as was in the case of Akbar. So you cannot
अरे बड़ी
measure.
सिंपल बात है मुकुल देव जी. मैं सॉरी, मैं मणिमुख को बीच में काट रहा हूँ. जब पॉलिटिकली नेसेसिटी हुई तो अकबर ने भी जजिया लगाया, कब नहीं लगाया. और जब जरूरत हुई तो औरंगजेब ने भी 20 साल तक जजिया नहीं लगाया. इट वाज only after the Rathore rebellion that jizya was imposed.
Yes.
1679 or 80 when jizya was imposed. When he came to the throne, it was 1667-68. इतने दिन तक कोई जजिया नहीं लगा था, है ना. 58-59 में he had come. Around 20 years there was no jizya. तो ये jizya का, there's a different, I mean, naturally it needs a very detailed answer. पिछले मतलब सीजन में हम लोगों ने इसके ऊपर एक लेक्चर किया था, जो आप गंगा जमनी के उस पे या आशा के उस पे जाके वो आप उसको देख सकते हैं कि जिजिया, टेम्पल डिस्ट्रक्शन, these are all political instruments.
Absolutely.
आप क्या समझ रहे हैं कि मोदी जी बहुत ही, या अडवाणी जी तो कभी मंदिर विजिट ही नहीं करते थे. इन स्पाइट ऑफ द फैक्ट उन्होंने जो आपका बाबरी मस्जिद थी उस पर बढ़ चढ़ के हिस्सा लिया. इनफैक्ट उन पे आज भी मुकदमा चल रहा है कि he was responsible for the destruction. He never is a person who goes to the temples and visits. So is the case with Modi ji. आज भी जो मॉस्क डिस्ट्रक्शन हुआ वो पॉलिटिकल रीजन से हुआ. कल भी जो टेम्पल डिस्ट्रक्शन हो रहा था या जिजिया लगाया जा रहा था, उसके पीछे पॉलिटिकल कंसिडरेशंस थे, which we can talk about later on. I must thank Manimugdha Sharma for dealing with this, explaining to us his views about Akbar. There are many questions, very relevant questions, but because now we have crossed around 2 hours, so let us stop here. But there are two very important, relevant questions. One is the relevance of Sulekut for Akbar. How far is the Sulekut of Akbar relevant in contemporary India? And secondly, can we consider Akbar, consider him as the emperor of secular India? I mean, these questions are also very important for us to understand. जैसा कि मणिमुग्ध शर्मा ने अपने आंसर के दौरान ये बात कही थी, the term secular has two meanings. One, the European sense of the term, where it means disassociation with any type of religion. European sense. Father Montserrat, who visited the court of Akbar at a time when Akbar was coming up with the idea of Sulekut. What did Father Montserrat write in his account? That by accepting all faiths, Akbar is in fact negating all faiths. तो वो समझ ही नहीं पा रहा था कि क्या ये सुलेकुल क्या चीज. So just like in Europe, secular means, but remember that Akbar's secularism was entirely different from the concept which prevailed among the Europeans. Akbar's secularism was the secularism of Gautama Buddha, tolerance of all, Shamanas and Brahmanas. कलिंग वो कौन सी जंग थी होने के बाद, जितने मैसेकर्स होने के बाद, Ashoka had come to realize that I should give equal treatment to all. So edict after edict on that. Ashoka's Dhamma. There also मजहब के खिलाफ बात नहीं हो रही है, equal treatment. That is what Akbar was talking about. Sulh, absolute peace. And that is why translations, so that each of us could understand
each other. Yeah.
Continued by Dara Shikoh, by his translations of Upanishads and so on and so forth. The same definition जो पहले गौतम बुद्धा ने दी थी, जो अकबर ने सेकुलरिज्म दी थी, exactly वही definition with change of words. जाहिर है कि सेंचुरीज बदल रही हैं, टाइम बदल रहा है. This is what the framers of the Constitution of India, they also had the same concept. जो इंडिया में के इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन में जो B.R. अम्बेडकर के उस पे बनाया गया है, उसमें भी जो सेकुलर बात किया गया है, आज जिसके खिलाफ हिंदुत्व खड़ी हुई है, वो ये है. इसीलिए बाज़ दफा पूछा जाता है कि जो कांग्रेस लीडर्स थे, मसलन सरदार पटेल या फला टेम्पल के इनॉग्रेशन में क्यों गए थे, कहाँ सेकुलर थे? नहीं, सेकुलर का ये मतलब नहीं था कि आप रिलीजन से दूर हो जाइए. इंडियन कॉन्टेक्स्ट में कभी नहीं रहा. इंडियन कॉन्टेक्स्ट में जो जवाहरलाल नेहरू के डिस्कवरी ऑफ इंडिया भी पढ़ के आपको आएगा, वही जो अकबर ने बात की थी, वही जो B.R. अम्बेडकर ने कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन ऑफ इंडिया में किया था, कि सारे मजहबों को आप टॉलरेट कीजिए. And that is one of the reasons that Akbar is still relevant to us today. It is his definition of secularism, which is the constitutional position of secularism in present day modern independent India. That is something which is missing in Pakistan from day one. And that is what differentiates us from the Gandhi's India from Jinnah's Pakistan. Unfortunate it is that today our present rulers are trying to follow a policy which they accused Muhammad Ali Jinnah to follow. Exclusive religious rights for a certain community. And that is why from 2014 till date, India is in a constant threat. That is why history is in threat. And that is why we are assembled here to discuss a person like Akbar. The relevance of Akbar, the relevance of writing a book on Akbar, which Manimugdha Sharma wrote, is only this. और सब चीजें छोड़ दीजिए, बारीकियों को छोड़ दीजिए. ऑटोमन्स के साथ क्या था, ईरानियों के साथ क्या था, ये पॉलिसी क्या थी, वो पॉलिसी क्या थी. लार्जर कॉन्टेक्स्ट में जो इंडिया विजुअलाइज अकबर ने किया था, वही जहांगीर के पीरियड में चला, वही शाहजहां के पीरियड में माइनर चेंजेस के साथ चला. यहाँ तक के औरंगजेब, जिसको आज हम इतना बुरा समझते हैं, उसके पीरियड में भी लार्जली स्पीकिंग वही पॉलिसी चली. यहाँ तक के नेशनल मूवमेंट में उसी भारत को हम लोगों ने सोचा, संविधान ने हमें वही भारत आज दिया जो कभी अकबर ने सोचा. And with these comments, I know that Manimugdha Sharma has a lot to say. He wants to add much more to what I have said. But everything has to end. We can meet some other time to discuss everything else. Uh, I would once again thank Mani, my friend, my junior, a good friend indeed, for agreeing to present his work during the course of these lectures. As I said, that his book was first inaugurated in a session where I was present. It was inaugurated by Irfan Habib.
And its first manuscript went to you as well.
I the first person who saw the manuscript of this book was myself. So I'm really thankful to Manimugdha Sharma for this beautiful discussion. I hope that every one of you would have actually enjoyed this session. Let me, in the end, just announce that next week, that is on 23rd of October, ये याद रखिए कि अब हम लोग इस बार हर सैटरडे को प्रोग्राम करेंगे. On the next Saturday, that is 23rd of October, we would have Professor Asim Siddiqui. Professor Asim Siddiqui is not a historian. Professor Asim Siddiqui is a professor of English, and he would be talking about yet another personality which we said we would be talking about, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. His topic would be appraising Sir Syed in the 21st century. वही टॉपिक जो मणिमुख शर्मा ने आज हम लोगों के साथ आपके सामने पेश किया था. With these words, I thank all of you. I thank Shagufta. And Shagufta, have you to say anything else? I must, before hand it over to you, I must say, I'm really very, very thankful to Shagufta Siddhi. बगैर शगुफ्ता के ये प्रोग्राम पॉसिबल नहीं है. ये
सर
जो
को
आप
मैं वीकेंड पे मैसेज करती थी.
ये सब बेचारी शगुफ्ता मैनेज करती हैं, आइडियाज ये देती हैं. Without her, an old man like me would never have been able to put these programs before you. Shagufta.
So, just wanted to say that I think there were questions about Akbar being a villain because he came in the way of love between Salim and Anarkali. And
Oh
there are
God.
so many questions that we have discussed. So, there is a huge element of myth in history since you will be talking about films and you'll be talking about literature and how certain history figures have been represented in literature and in films and songs. So I think it's worth the while to actually discuss myths versus reality or facts versus myths.
I don't know how many of your audience still remains after 2 hours, but let me assure whosoever is there, and my assurance would then be present on the YouTube as well, that we are going to deal with all these aspects. जो आप लोगों ने सवाल पूछे थे या जो अभी विक्रांत शर्मा पूछ रहे हैं, वो सवालों के हम लोग उत्तर अवश्य देंगे अपने सब्सिक्वेंट प्रोग्राम्स में. हम लोग एक टॉपिक जो सोच रहे हैं रखने के लिए वो सोच रहे हैं एक पूरी रूब्रिक myth and history. उसके तहत large number of your questions would be answered as far as these queries are concerned. इनके सब के आपको जवाब जस्ट थोड़ा सा धैर्य रखिए. हर चीज 1 घंटे 1.5 घंटे में डील नहीं हो सकती. मैंने उन सवालात को देखा था, लेकिन एक अप्रोप्रिएट टाइम आएगा जब आपके ये उत्तर वहां पे हम लोग देने की कोशिश करेंगे. थैंक यू वेरी मच.
Thank you.
Thank
It
you,
was
everyone.
great.
Thank
It was
you, Mani. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure being on the show and to converse with with Nadeem sir.
Professor
जैसे कि
Rizavi.
मैंने शुरू में ही कह दिया था कि उस्तादों के सामने उस्तादी करना तो मेरे बस की बात नहीं है. जिन लोगों से सीखा है उन्हीं के सामने उन्हीं के सब्जेक्ट पे बात करना बड़ा मुश्किल होता है. So,
नहीं, प्रोफेसर
thank
रिजावी भी प्रोफेसर हबीब के ही स्टूडेंट हैं एंड सब चलता है यहाँ पे lineage है. और I just want to share with all our viewers that we will see you next Saturday and we will be informing you of the topic, and of course you know the speaker. It's Professor Asim Siddiqui, and we will see you next Saturday at 7. Thank you all. Have a very good night.
you.
Bye.